Have you ever watched breaking news coverage of a natural disaster or conflict and felt that strange mixture of horror and inevitability? You see the destruction, the suffering, the chaos, and you probably think, this is terrible, but someone has to help rebuild. Yeah, you might even feel guilty for being safe while others suffer, or overwhelmed by the complexity of global crises that seem far beyond your understanding. You probably assumed that the billions spent on disaster response and military intervention represent losses, money burned up in explosions, wasted in bureaucratic inefficiency, or simply the unfortunate cost of living in a dangerous world. When you see the same companies appearing at every crisis with their logos on trucks and equipment, you likely thought, well, at least someone is helping. But what if I told you that for a specific network of corporations and investors, these disasters aren't losses at all, they're business opportunities? What if that feeling of inevitability isn't a natural response to human tragedy, but a carefully engineered psychological state designed to prevent you from asking the most important question: who actually profits when everything falls apart? My name is Pig, and I spend way too much time studying how systems of power actually operate, the hidden mechanisms that transfer wealth from the many to the few, the psychological techniques that make exploitation feel like salvation, and the legal frameworks that transform human suffering into quarterly earnings reports. I've traced money flows through disaster zones, analyzed contracts signed while bodies were still being counted, and documented how the same corporations appear at every catastrophe with identical playbooks. If you want comfortable narratives about humanitarian response and noble intentions, this isn't that channel. But if you want to understand how modern capitalism has perfected the art of converting crisis into capital, how your tax dollars flow from public treasuries to private shareholders through the machinery of disaster, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you see every rebuilding effort and humanitarian intervention you've ever witnessed. Here's what they tell you about disaster capitalism and crisis response. When catastrophe strikes, whether natural disaster, conflict, or economic collapse, governments mobilize resources to help affected populations. Private companies are brought in because they possess the expertise, infrastructure, and efficiency that overwhelmed public sectors desperately need during emergencies. The textbook explanation presents this as humanitarian necessity. Economists will tell you that market mechanisms ensure competitive pricing and rapid response. The official purpose is noble: save lives, restore infrastructure, rebuild communities stronger than before. International development experts describe this as building back better, using the clean slate of disaster to modernize infrastructure and integrate affected regions into the global economy. Defense contractors explain their role as providing security in lawless environments where humanitarian work would otherwise be impossible. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund frame their involvement as providing essential capital and expertise that devastated nations desperately require. On paper, these public-private partnerships accelerate recovery while sharing risks between government and industry. Sounds reasonable, right? Disasters require massive resources, and governments can't handle everything alone. Private sector efficiency combined with public sector coordination should equal faster recovery. But if that's true, then explain these contradictions. Why do the same corporations appear at every major disaster with pre-written contracts? Why do their stock prices surge when catastrophes strike? Why do affected populations consistently end up poorer and more dependent after the help arrives? And why, according to a 2020 Brown University Costs of War Project analysis, have post-9/11 military interventions cost over $8 trillion, while global instability has reached historic highs? Let me show you what's actually happening behind the official story. Here's what the art of war profiteering actually represents: a systematized process of converting human catastrophe into guaranteed profit streams through the deliberate exploitation of crisis conditions that eliminate normal market constraints, democratic oversight, and competitive bidding processes. This isn't humanitarian aid that happens to involve corporations. It's a business model that requires disaster to function profitably. The brilliance of the system lies in making victims grateful for their exploitation. When you're drowning, you don't negotiate the price of the life raft. When your city lies in ruins, you don't scrutinize reconstruction contracts. When bombs are falling, you don't audit defense spending. Crisis creates a psychological and political environment where normal safeguards disappear, and that environment is the actual product being sold. Here's exactly how wealth flows from devastated populations to corporate shareholders. First, disaster creates urgent need and suspends normal procurement processes. Governments invoke emergency powers that bypass competitive bidding, environmental regulations, and transparency requirements. Second, a small number of pre-positioned corporations, those with existing government relationships and crisis response capabilities, receive no bid or limited bid contracts worth billions. Third, these contracts use cost-plus structures, meaning companies receive their expenses plus guaranteed profit margins, eliminating all financial risk. Fourth, contract scope expands through change orders and extensions, often multiplying original values. Finally, temporary corporate presence becomes permanent infrastructure with ongoing service contracts that extract wealth long after media attention fades. Who profits from this mechanism? According to a 2020 Brown University analysis, the top 5 defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, received over $2.1 trillion in post-9/11 war-related contracts. But weapons manufacturers represent only one component. Halliburton subsidiary KBR received $39.5 billion in Iraq-related contracts between 2003 to 2011, according to Financial Times investigations. Bechtel, DynCorp, and Fluor Corporation collectively received over $8 billion for Iraq reconstruction, per the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction final report. The extraction mechanism functions like mandatory insurance that only pays the insurance company. When disaster strikes, affected populations must use designated services at monopoly prices with no alternatives while continuing to pay through government expenditures and debt obligations long after reconstruction completes, except the rebuilt infrastructure often belongs to the contractors, not the communities. Think of it this way. Imagine a fire department paid not to prevent fires, but only when fires burn extensively, and that same fire department owns the rebuilding company, insurance adjustment firm, and lumber yard. Now imagine they also lobbied to remove fire safety codes and write laws governing fire investigations. Would you be surprised if fires became more frequent and destructive? This isn't a bug in the system. It's the primary feature. This playbook has been refined over more than a century through deliberate policy evolution. The blueprint isn't hidden. It's documented in government archives, corporate strategy papers, and the memoirs of those who designed it. The foundational template emerged during World War I, when companies like DuPont discovered that wartime emergency contracts generated extraordinary profits. A 1934 Senate investigation led by Gerald Nye documented that munitions manufacturers achieved 200 to 300% profit margins during WWII, while soldiers died in trenches. The investigation revealed that some companies actively lobbied for U.S. war entry to protect financial interests, establishing the core pattern: crisis creates opportunity for those positioned to exploit it. The system evolved significantly during World War II with cost-plus contracting. According to U.S. Government Accountability Office historical analysis, this arrangement guaranteed contractors their costs plus fixed profit percentages, eliminating financial risk while ensuring profit regardless of efficiency. This became the standard model for military contracting and later expanded to disaster response. By January 17, 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower, a five-star general, not a pacifist, used his farewell address to warn about the military-industrial complex. He recognized an emerging pattern: a permanent arms industry that would exert unwarranted influence on government policy. Eisenhower warned that this industry's profit requirements would eventually override national peace interests. The modern blueprint was perfected through 3 key phases. First, 1990s Balkans conflict saw wholesale military logistics privatization. According to a 2002 Congressional Research Service report, private contractor to military personnel ratios reached 1-to-1. Unprecedented levels. Companies like DynCorp and Brown and Root, later KBR, provided everything from base construction to food service, establishing templates for comprehensive military outsourcing. Second, the 2003 Iraq War represented full disaster capitalism implementation. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction documented $138 billion in Iraq reconstruction and operations contracts, with at least $60 billion flowing to private contractors. Crucially, many contracts were signed within months of invasion, before a need assessment was possible. Halliburton's KBR received a no-bid contract worth up to $7 billion for oil infrastructure repair, awarded by an Army Corps of Engineers where former Vice President Dick Cheney's company maintained deep relationships. Third, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 proved the model worked for natural disasters. According to CorpWatch investigations, FEMA awarded $3.4 billion in initial contracts, with over half going to companies with existing Homeland Security relationships. Fluor Corporation received $3.6 billion for temporary housing. Trailers later found to contain toxic formaldehyde levels. Within weeks, Louisiana suspended wage protections, allowing contractors to pay below minimum wage while charging government premium rates. Notice the consistent pattern: suspension of oversight during crisis, pre-positioning of connected corporations, cost-plus contract structures, guaranteeing profit, scope expansion beyond original crisis, and permanent transformation of public goods into private profit centers. By the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the blueprint was so refined that corporate contractors arrived before aid organizations. According to ProPublica and NPR investigations, the American Red Cross spent $488 million in Haiti, but built only 6 permanent homes, while contractors constructed luxury hotels and industrial parks as displaced Haitians remained in tent cities. Here's how they weaponize your natural human responses to tragedy, turning compassion into mechanisms that enable exploitation. Behavioral economists have documented that humans exhibit action bias, overwhelming urges to do something when facing crisis. Research in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making demonstrates that time pressure and emotional arousal significantly impair people's ability to evaluate costs and alternatives. The disaster profiteering industry deliberately triggers this response, positioning themselves as the only ones who can help right now, making any questioning seem like callous delay. They also exploit authority bias, our tendency to defer to perceived experts during uncertainty. Under stress, people increase reliance on authority figures while decreasing critical evaluation. Contractors arrive with Pentagon relationships, government badges, and official appearances, making their presence seem legitimate rather than opportunistic. Loss aversion plays a crucial role. Governments and populations desperately want to prevent further losses, accepting unfavorable terms they would never consider normally. A 2016 American Economic Review study showed that decision makers facing potential losses accept riskier and costlier arrangements than those facing potential gains. Here's the emotional journey they design. First comes shock and horror at catastrophe itself, making you desperate for any solution and grateful for any help. Contractors time their arrival for this exact window when emotional arousal is highest and critical thinking lowest. Next comes hope. As you see resources mobilizing, this hope makes you vulnerable to accepting whatever terms are offered because you're focused on recovery possibilities, not contract details. Then comes investment. Once help is accepted and contract signed, sunk cost fallacy kicks in. Even when problems become apparent, psychological pressure continues because you've already invested so much. Doubt arrives as problems become undeniable, but manipulation deepens through blame shifting. We're doing our best in difficult conditions. Local populations aren't cooperating. They reframe their extraction as your failure to be adequate victims, leading to deeper investment and dependency. Each disaster is treated as unique rather than part of a pattern. Haiti is distinct from Iraq, different from Katrina, unrelated to Puerto Rico. Media coverage focuses on specific circumstances rather than consistent corporate response patterns. This atomization strategy prevents pattern recognition. If each disaster is unique, exploitation can't be systemic. The shame is individual, while exploitation is collective. Communities think they uniquely failed to manage reconstruction properly, not realizing identical contract structures and outcomes appeared in dozens of other disasters. According to a 2019 Nation investigation, disaster-affected communities that connected across different crises and shared contractor behavior information were significantly more successful at demanding accountability. Before the Iraq invasion began, USAID awarded Bechtel Corporation a $680 million contract for reconstruction. According to Center for Public Integrity documents, only 7 companies were invited to bid, with contracts structured to expand to $2.3 billion through modifications. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction documented that of $60 billion in reconstruction spending, approximately 40% went to overhead, security, and profit rather than actual reconstruction. KBR overcharged the government $1.4 billion for fuel delivery alone, charging $5.23 per gallon for gasoline costing $1.32. Vice President Dick Cheney had served as Halliburton's CEO from 1995 to 2000, receiving a $34 million payout when joining government while continuing deferred compensation. Halliburton's government contracts increased from $1.2 billion in the 5 years before Iraq War to $39.5 billion in the 8 years after, according to Center for Responsive Politics data. Of 8,206 planned reconstruction projects, only 3,277 were completed, with many non-functional within months due to poor construction. Meanwhile, major contractors reported record profits, with Halliburton's stock price increasing 279% between March 2003 and December 2011. Within days of Hurricane Katrina, FEMA awarded over $3.4 billion in initial contracts. Shaw Group received $200 million for debris removal, eventually expanding to $1.65 billion. According to Government Accountability Office audits, FEMA made $1.4 billion in improper payments, primarily contractor overbilling rather than victim fraud. Fluor Corporation's $3.6 billion temporary housing contract resulted in FEMA paying an average $250,000 per trailer. Trailers normally costing $20,000. These trailers contained dangerous formaldehyde levels, leading to a $42.6 million class action settlement. 5 years after Katrina, New Orleans had lost 100,000 residents, predominantly low-income African Americans, while wealth concentration increased dramatically. Less than 30% of reconstruction contracts went to Louisiana companies and only 10% to minority-owned businesses, despite African Americans comprising 67% of pre-Katrina population. International donors pledged $13.5 billion for Haiti reconstruction. The American Red Cross raised $488 million, but built exactly 6 permanent homes. Internal documents show $43 million went to overhead and $124 million to other organizations taking additional overhead cuts. Of $9.04 billion in USAID and State Department contracts, only 2.5% went to Haitian organizations. The remaining 97.5% went to international contractors, UN agencies, and foreign NGOs. The Caracol Industrial Park, a $300 million Clinton Foundation project, displaced 366 farmers while being built by international contractors. 5 years post-earthquake, 55,000 Haitians remained in displacement camps while contractors built luxury hotels. Haiti's GDP per capita in 2015 was lower than 2009 levels, despite $13.5 billion in aid, demonstrating how humanitarian disaster converted into permanent aid economy, enriching external actors while maintaining Haitian dependency. When aggregating individual cases into systemic scale, the numbers become staggering. According to the Brown University Costs of War Project's 2021 analysis, post 9/11 war-related contracts totaled approximately $14 trillion through 2020, with top 50 defense contractors receiving over $2.8 trillion, but war profiteering represents only part of the picture. The United States alone spent $450 billion on disaster response and recovery between 2010 to 2020, with approximately 60% flowing to private contractors based on FEMA expenditure data. Globally, the disaster response and reconstruction industry is estimated at $180 billion annually. Let's examine the extraction mathematics. Average major disaster contracts equals $5 billion. Annual global major disasters equals 17.5 average profit margin equals 17.5%. Annual profit extraction equals 5 billion times 17.5 times 17.5% equals $15.3 billion. Over a decade, this compounds to $153 billion in pure profit transferred from disaster-affected populations to contractor shareholders. That equals Hungary's GDP, or 2.5 million American workers' combined annual median salaries. The $14 trillion in post-9/11 war contracts represents 2.5 times total U.S. Student debt, $1.7 trillion. Enough for free 4-year college education for every American student for 70 years. 3 times the amount needed to end global extreme poverty per World Bank, estimates $42,000 for every person in the United States. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the U.S. needs $4.5 trillion in infrastructure investment. War contract spending alone could have funded this 3 times over. These statistics represent human costs rarely calculated in official accounts. The Costs of War Project documents that post 9/11 wars killed approximately 900,000 people and displaced 38 million. But economic extraction has its own mortality. A 2018 Lancet study found that structural adjustment programs and debt servicing, often imposed as disaster reconstruction loan conditions, correlated with increased infant mortality rates. When government service contractor debt instead of funding healthcare, people die. This system protects itself through 3 interlocking mechanisms: regulatory capture, narrative control, and legal framework design, creating self-perpetuating cycles where extracted wealth purchases political protection. The same people designing these systems regulate them. According to a 2019 Project on Government Oversight investigation, 380 high-ranking Defense Department officials moved to defense contractor positions between 2008 to 2018, including 25 generals and 9 admirals. Reversely, the Defense Department employed 645 former contractor executives in senior positions between 2001 to 2020. Defense contractors contributed $285 million to federal candidates between 2010 to 2020, according to Federal Election Commission data, with contributions concentrated among Armed Services and Appropriations Committee members. This creates direct legislative capture where contractor interests override public interests. The industry controls information through media ownership, think tank funding, and academic capture. According to Columbia Journalism Review investigations, top 5 defense contractors spent $84 million on major news outlet advertising between 2012 to 2016, creating indirect editorial pressure. Defense contractors funded at least 50 Washington think tanks between 2014 to 2019, contributing over $1 billion according to The Intercept and The Nation investigations. The Center for Strategic and International Studies received $8.3 million from defense contractors while publishing papers supporting increased defense spending without always disclosing funding sources. Laws enable exploitation while maintaining oversight appearances. The federal acquisition regulations complexity creates barriers favoring established contractors. FEMA used emergency waivers for 73% of initial disaster response contracts between 2005 to 2017, with average waivers lasting 247 days beyond immediate emergencies. Cost-plus contracting remains legal despite documented abuse. 42% of major defense contracts use cost-plus structures according to Defense Department Inspector General reports. The government's suspension and debarment system has been used against major contractors only twice in 20 years, with penalties typically under 3% of contract values. Individual pattern recognition. Now that you understand the blueprint, you can recognize it everywhere. Watch for immediate suspension of normal procurement processes justified by emergency. Notice when temporary contracts get repeatedly extended or expanded. Pay attention when local businesses and workers are excluded. Despite being most familiar with affected areas, the language reveals the game. Public-private partnership usually means public risk and private profit. Building back better often means building for different people. Emergency measures suspending oversight tend to become permanent. Ask 3 questions. Who profits from this crisis? What safeguards are being suspended? What's the exit strategy? Awareness disrupts their business model because it functions through assumed legitimacy. When populations understand exploitation rather than help, contractor operations become politically costly. Historical examples prove exposure creates reform possibilities. After extensive Iraq contractor abuse documentation, Congress passed the Commission on Wartime Contracting Act in 2008, creating oversight mechanisms that recovered $7 billion according to the Commission's final report. Current pressure points include demanding Pentagon audit compliance, supporting divestment from weapons manufacturers, and challenging emergency contracting waivers. States with stronger revolving door restrictions showed 31% fewer questionable contract awards, according to Project On Government Oversight Analysis. Document everything if your area faces disaster. Organize mutual aid networks before crises strike. Demand transparency through FOIA requests and public records. Support local contractors when possible, as money staying local multiplies through communities while external extraction leaves permanently. This system represents one component of broader disaster capitalism appearing in privatized prisons, charter school proliferation, healthcare profiteering, and infrastructure privatization. The blueprint remains consistent. Create or exploit crisis, suspend safeguards, award connected contracts, extract maximum wealth. Leave populations more dependent. You're no longer a passive consumer of crisis narratives. You're an informed observer who can help others recognize patterns. Every person understanding the system represents one more person who can't be exploited through manufactured urgency. Every community recognizing patterns can organize resistance. Systems designed by humans can be redesigned by humans. The first step is seeing the design clearly. Now, the question isn't whether the system will change, but whether enough people will understand it before the next crisis provides another extraction opportunity for those who profit from catastrophe. The blueprint is visible. What you do with that knowledge determines everything.